As Russ said, I'm Robin Bells. I'm citizen science lead, and part of our committee responsibility is to conduct the honey and census survey. So we had 167 responses in this year's survey, and I broke them down by zip code. Yeah. And as you can see, no surprise, probably the biggest amount is in Exton area. But it was interesting that how many members we have outside of Chester County. So this shows the number of pounds that were reported, again, by zip code. We had, sorry. We had the Chester Springs area coming in at 10,000 pounds. And everything else is pretty much spread out. So dividing the number of hives by number of pounds gives us the number, this is the number of production hives. And again, no surprise because of the number of pounds, the Chester Springs area again came in at the highest number.
Average production per hive.
Yep, there you go. So then dividing the pounds by the number of hives, we come up with the average production per hive. And as you can see, the numbers pretty much are in the 40s and 50s average, taking out the Chester Springs numbers. So looking at the past 2 years that we've been doing the honey survey, our trends of increased average of pounds per member is going up, which is good. The average number of hives per member is going up too. However, we had a decrease in participation. Right now, so for this year, only about a quarter of the members participated. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir to everybody here, but we probably definitely need more data to be more accurate, for what we have. And these are just the summaries. We're putting this in the newsletter, right, Russ? I believe. So that way you could check it out too. With the counties, we get Chester County obviously is the highest, and then Delaware and Berks come in the distant second and third, Montgomery in there too.
So the highest county was Norristown or city was Norristown?
Chester Springs right here.
Yeah, holy cow.
Yeah. But again, that's kind of skews the whole thing. Yeah, exactly. Probably.
Pounds a hive.
Yeah.
Pounds per hive. Timberton had 130 pounds per hive.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Norristown 122. That's pretty significant compared to other areas.
Yeah. And in the survey, I asked for the type of beekeeper, and no surprise, backyard beekeepers comes up way ahead.
There no slide after this?
No, that was it.
Cool.
So we're done.
All right, thank you, Rob. Appreciate that information.
Again, participate next year.
Yes, please. So if you've been on Beach Chat last Friday night and the previous Friday night, a lot of people have been talking about, what we should be doing with our hives in this crazy kind of weather. And the general consensus is we're going to have about a week, maybe even 10 days of cooler temps, a bunch of rain coming in too. So I went into my 5 hives today, and I got one that's in a 3 deep. It's a pretty big hive. And about 2.5, 3 weeks ago, I gave each one of my hives 10 pounds of honey. 10 pounds of fondant. And of course, the big hive went through it. And I went into another hive that I had a bunch of extra fondant left over. So I put about 5 pounds, picked up the edge of the hive. It seems pretty heavy, so I think I'm going to be good in terms of feeding, with fondant. But they were they were bringing in a lot of green colored pollen and some yellow colored pollen today as well. The general consensus is from a lot of the people on Beach Chat was there's a lot of brood in the boxes right now, which is going to make them consume more honey and or fondant or sugar reward and pollen. So we have to keep up making sure that they've got enough resources until the weather gets warmer and they'll be able to start flying. Does anybody else have any comments about what your bees are doing or your insight?
Just the bottom line is make sure they're fed.
Make sure they're fed, yeah.
Right.
You've had them all year, you've treated them all year, you've fed them all year. Now's a critical time. If they don't have enough food, they're not going to make it. So good information to know. I normally have the degree days, but the website was not functioning today when I went up there to pull it up several times over a few hours. And all the data I have is just from the last time. So Howard wants to talk about the swarm list.
So every year we publish for the public a list of our members who are willing and able to go out and capture swarms. If you've never done it before, please don't sign up because you don't have the experience to do it. But do, once I publish the list, look who's near you and call some of them and volunteer to help them when they get a call. And that way you'll get some experience, learn how to do it. So a while back, I sent out an email to with a link to the survey. And I meant to go look where on the website you actually go to answer surveys if you don't have my email. But somewhere out on our website, you'll find surveys, and there's one for the swarm list. So I ask questions like your location, which areas you're willing to cover to get swarms, etc. And then once that, by the middle of March, I want that list, and I'll accumulate it all into a list on the website. I create a PDF. I create a map that shows for the public so they can see who's available in their areas. And if you miss the March 15th deadline, I'm not going to add you back to the PDF. I'm not going to add you back to the map. I'll add you to the website, and that's about it. So please get in by the 15th of March. Any questions about any of that? Anybody awake?
Some of the questions you have is if you do cutouts, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That question, cutouts. So unless you're prepared to and have an insurance policy to cover you if you screw up, cutting into somebody's house to pull out a swarm. If you've never done it, I'd suggest don't do it. Call some of the experts up that are able to do that, and maybe even have construction licenses to rebuild what you tear up and put back in. So it would be good if you've never been on a swarm list and seeing swarms to, like Howard said, call some people up that are in your area and say, hey, I just want to tag along and watch what you do to recover a swarm, whether it be wild or in a house or attic or wherever it might be. Is Tim here tonight? I didn't see him. Is Tim in?
He's hiding.
Hiding in the back. Tim, your pictures of that wild swarm, well, I wouldn't say swarm, the wild hive in that tree, you cut that up, right? You were part of that? You recovered it? You want to talk a little bit about the process you did? It looked very interesting from the photos.
So I went there below temperature of flight, put wire mesh on either side of the log and then rolled it uphill onto a trailer, brought it back to another yard outside 2.5 miles of that radius, and then put a honey super on top with 9 frames and left a gap to put fondant and feed down to bring the bees up. So I've fed them twice since. They're on pollen substitute. They're building. They're fine. So we did actually do a wine and honey tasting with R5 Wines in Downingtown about 4 days later, and we actually chopped up the wild comb into sections for tasting. It was quite unique. It was sort of halfway between summer and fall. The tree was felled the day before I got the email. So with that cold temperature, all the bees went back to the brood chamber of that trunk section. I just trimmed it down, made it square, and rolled it up.
Interesting. How long did it take for the bees to leave the trunk of the tree into the boxes?
Well, it's gonna take a brood cycle.
Oh, okay, yeah. I'm
So
sorry.
they'll move up with temperature, right, with the heat rising, and then they'll move up to the feed, because all the feed was left in the trunk sections where I removed it.
Okay.
Okay, so once the pupae hatches out, everything will move up.
Yeah, it was very interesting photographs. I'm glad it turned out well. We're gonna have I asked earlier if anybody had any questions. I was gonna have an open mic night. So whoever wants to talk about any bee-related subject is more than welcome to grab the mic and ask questions or tell us an interesting story that you ran across in the last month since our last meeting. Or if anybody's online that would like to share something, we'd be all ears. I don't see any takers. George.
So this year, I've been keeping bees for about 10 years. So last year I did half my hives overwintered in a single box. And this year I overwintered all my hives in a single box. So my winter configuration is 1 deep. And on top of that 1 deep, 2 things, either I made a candy board, so they had a 1.5 inch candy board, or they got a shim, for fondant feeding. And on top of that, I just put a 3/4 to 1.5 inch insulation board in the outer cover. So basically a single deep to overwinter. Now I know this winter was a little atypical, right? Because it was warmer and the weather wasn't that cold. So it was an easier winter. But what I found is that of the hives that I overwintered in single deeps, they all survived. So I only had a bunch of hives that didn't survive that were double nukes. So if they were stacked in a double nuke configuration, they were more likely to starve than a 110 frame. So that was interesting. Usually by this time of year, when I go around and look at the candy boards, because I went around and looked at all my candy boards yesterday, because that was the first time I popped open some of my hives. Usually the candy boards are gone. I'd say at least half of the candy board still had 1/3 to 1/2 of the candy left. So I was quite surprised about how much candy was still left at the top of the hives. What else? I was going to make another comment about what I saw yesterday.
Hive beetles?
I wasn't looking for hive beetles yesterday, so I was just looking at it. Oh, the other thing I mentioned is I did my emergency feeding differently this year. So usually in the past, I put emergency feeding on all my hives like in December, so we made the candy boards and the candy boards went on in December and then they were set. This year, once a month, I went around to my hives and because they were only single, so they were easy to assess, and if the hive was light, then they got the candy board or the fondant. And if they didn't, then they didn't get emergency feed. So again, that was different than putting emergency feed on everything. And like I said, I had about 60 hives going into winter, and the only ones I lost were a few nukes that were in a 5/5 configuration, and I lost them because of starvation. It was clear, when I opened up the hive, there was a big pile of dead bees on the bottom board and no food. So I know why those died. So no, the only insulation was at the top. Most of them had solid bottom boards. None of them had top ventilation, and they were all pretty much in a single 10 frame deep. So I just wanted to share that because it's surely a lot different than what I was doing, 5 or 10 years ago. And I'm not saying that's the right way to do it. I'm just saying that in this particular year, that way worked and looked like it worked well. So that's all I had. I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments about it, because I learned this from Steve Rapaski. Some of you know Steve Rapaski. He was the past president of the PA State Beekeepers Association. And Steve overwinters, and he's been doing this for a while. He overwinters all his hives at 8 frame single deeps with a candy board. So that's his winter configuration. He's been telling me that for years. That's all you need. So there's I don't know how many hives Steve is running, but he's running a lot of hives, and so. I mean, this method has the potential, if you do this, you're obviously going to need a lot less sugar feed. in the fall, because you're only, feeding enough to bring it up to, instead of the traditional double deep that's running over 100 pounds, a single deep is probably running 60 pounds or so going into winter. So, you're gonna be making up a lot less sugar syrup in the fall. Thank you. Someone's gonna comment on the craziness. Yeah, so when Apivar went on, so when I treated with Apivar in September, all the honey supers came off the box, and at that point they were all in one deep. So basically September on, they were down to one deep.
So is the theory that, or thinking that you're keeping the bee population down, or that they're keeping their heat in one place, therefore not needing to?
Well, I don't think they're obviously they can't move anywhere. They're stuck in one box, so they're not moving. There's a smaller box to heat, right? Their house is smaller. It's now one box instead of two boxes or plus. So, the third without top ventilation, maybe they go into torpor quicker or more effectively. So maybe their metabolic rate drops. It stays down through the winter, so they're consuming less.
And the whole upper versus non or upper is that if the thermodynamics are better, without
the ongoing heat loss,
therefore it keeps the heat constant, so they don't have to.
Yeah, so,
work as much.
there's all kinds of potential reasons to why. Again, with that said, the average temperature was warm this winter. So I have a concern, like, well, what happens, in a winter where it's more like New England winter and I have a single deep, are they gonna consume more and run out quicker? I don't know that, because yet last year I did it on about half my hives last year, and last year wasn't that cold either. So two non-cold winters maybe tricking me a little bit, but.
The internet.
I love it. I'm now an internet star.
Are you gonna run a single brood chamber in the hive?
Yeah, well, yes. So I'm all in on the single brood chamber idea, as far as managing the hives with a single brood chamber. And again, it's an ongoing journey for me to learn best how to effectively do that, to push them down to one box. And some of it will involve vertical splitting the hive or demarree in the hive to make sure that queen has enough room to lay in the brood chamber. But, my idea is to try to run my brood in a single most of the year and then overwinter in a single too. So that's my latest my thought here. Who thinks I'm stupid? Come on, there's gotta be somebody who thinks this is a dumb idea. Yeah. I mean, you just keep learning, you just keep observing and keep trying different things and keep learning. So that's all, so that was my winter experience, and I would say, just, if you're gonna do it, make sure you check on them. I mean, you can do anything as long as you check on it, right? So if you're going to do it, I would say, feed them, when you're running a single deep, the one thing you have to remember is that they put very little honey in that deep, right? In the brood chamber, there's very little honey. So if you're taking off all your honey supers, at any time when you're running a single deep brood chamber, they're not going to have much honey left in the hive. So you have to remember that. So as soon as I pull that honey, the last honey super off before I do Apivar, you got to treat at that point. And then you just check them once a month. And for singles, it's easy. You just sort of go behind the hive and sort of, what a single feels like, right? It's not like you're trying to lift you're just trying to lift one box. And, if the one box is heavy, you're fine. If the one box is light, then you just put some emergency feed on it. And not all hives, it's very interesting. When you do it this way, you'll notice that some hives, some of my 10 frame deeps are you would swear they didn't eat anything all winter. That they may have consumed maybe 15 or 20 pounds so far the whole winter because they're still heavy. I was like, okay, that one doesn't need anything. That one doesn't need anything. So if they don't need anything, they just have the inner cover and the insulation board. So I know I can keep track of which hives need something. So once they need something, then if I have a candy board, they get a candy board. If I don't have a candy board, then they get a shim and some fondant. So I can kind of keep track of which ones needed stuff and which ones were able to not need anything. And I don't see any reason to put emergency feed on the hive if it doesn't need it, right? So if it's heavy, then save some of the emergency feed, because some of the hives will make it through the winter without needing it. So that was an interesting observation too I had this winter. So that's it. Unless there's any other questions about my single overwintering. No. Okay.
Sounds
Thanks.
good. So we went through this, I had the same graph up from last month. And the three different colors are, this is 2023 from January till today, right? Today. The the black is the 30-year average of all the data accumulated there. And then yellow is 2022 last year this time. So basically, we've been ahead all the way from about January 5th, much warmer this year than last year by a significant amount. And it ends up being, we've got basically 24 days warmer of degree days than we did last year. So a lot of people have been talking about it, you know, are the hives going to really swarm? They have the potential to, because if it's been that much warmer, they're going to have more brood. The hives are going to be packed a lot tighter. So you're going to have to do some manipulation techniques to make sure that they don't swarm, or split your hives earlier than normal. So I just find this, you know, Paul's always showed this. I find it very interesting about how much warmer we really are. But yet some people up here go to Florida for a month, you know.
Where it's really warm.
Where it's really warm, yeah.
And why some Italian hives get a tremendous advantage from something that we call the sessions. Okay. And the other thing is that why do the Chinese in their beekeeping use circular hive configurations? Okay. So let's start off. Okay. We start with anecdotally. So first of all, we'll have it. I have one apiary site that I've had for 15 years. One hive will always perform way better than any other hive. Even though one season you would have it when the queen is absolutely useless and will produce one frame of brood, that hive always produces in excess of 150 pounds per year. Yeah. The answer to the question is drifting. Okay, what determines drifting?
Okay,
And a number of things. Okay, so very quickly, drifting, normally we have drifting occurring from one location to another location. When the bees go for orientation flights, they will often return to another hive. Common knowledge, we all know that. Sometimes the forager bees will go out, they collect a lot of nectar, they will come to a different hive. Now, this is amazing stuff because sometimes you are able to ascertain why. Okay, so the basic principle, and I think all beekeepers will know this, is that the two extremities of an apiary site. So if I have 10 hives in a row, the basic extremities of the hive result in the fact that either on my left-hand side or the right-hand side will gain bees. Okay, so we all know that. The second principle behind it is the center hives potentially could gain bees as well. So not only the end ones, but also the central location on a straight line basis will gain. And this is why it's particularly difficult for choosing queens for queen rearing. You might find that, hey, this hive always performs well. This hive is absolutely wonderful. This hive produces way more way more honey, and is always bigger than the other ones. And it might purely because of the location in the apiary site.
Right.
As we said, the Chinese know this very well. They put a lot of documentation into it, and their apiary sites are often in a circular fashion. All the hives facing inwards. It also allows the second advantage that we have with the circular apiary site is the fact that all the bees are going towards the center and you can walk around the outside without interfering with the travel path of the honeybees. Okay, so let's go into a little bit more detail. On my 1 apiary site, every year for 15 years, the one left-hand side at the start of the season always performs better. In other words, the bees drift one way. And the reasoning behind that is that there is early season flow that is on the left-hand side. So all the bees are traveling from all the 10 hives or 12 hives, however many I have there, they fly out and they go out onto the left-hand side to forage. When they come back, it is a natural instinct for the bees to come back and enter into a different hive that is closer. It's not a natural, they don't all do that, but periodically some of them will say, hey, I'm lazy, I don't want to go to the end one. And amazing, for 15 years now, we have the reverse happening later on in the season. I have a huge stand of black locusts on the other side. So the flow changes direction. Now all the bees go out, they go to the black locust flow, but they're coming back from the right-hand side. And what do? They see the first hive and they will enter the end hives. Okay, so these are things that we must look at. Okay, we must look at where in the apiary site is it. Now there's a lot of documentation about banks of hives. You can have 3, 3, 3. Okay, which one do they favor? Second or fourth or fifth point, bees prefer certain colors. If you have a light blue painted hive,
Ooh, light
it'll
blue.
encourage the bees to go to that hive.
If you have a light blue
They
hive,
like the light blue. So if you want to have one hive that accepts more bees than the other ones, remember coloring is important. Another thing that's well known, if you can artificially make a hive bigger, in other words, you put a facade in front of the hive, so it's more visible in other hives, the bees will go to that one. Okay. So now when you're choosing for queen rearing, what is my best hive? Should all of them be the same? Should you swap them around? And the only way to determine that is obviously you're looking at your queens and the brood rearing and the amount of bees that are actually physically produced by that hive. So you look at the queen, you look at the temperament and so on. The next thing that you look at, and I'm sure every one of you, those of you who've been beekeeping for a long time will know this, you've seen it. One of my hives over there always performs well, but the other one doesn't because the bees are drifting. Okay. One of the most important things as well, and this is one accredited to the Italian bees. They are particularly good at this. These are natural tendency. Now, you might all know Tom Seeley and seen a lot of his presentations where he gives a proximity of the bees. But in a natural environment, you'll often have beehives located in one area. In other words, there's a tree that's falling down and it's got multiple holes. So you might have 2, 3, 4, or even 5 beehives in a very close proximity. The thing that the Italian bees are pretty good at, number one, robbing, but we're not talking about robbing at the moment. Italian bees are also very, very good at sessions. I think we all know what sessions are. In beekeeping, we call them orientation flights. Okay. If you're a clever colony, is what inadvertently a lot of the Italian hives have got, you will do a mass display of orientation flights. So it looks a bit like the bees are swarming. And what happens with the orientation flights is as the bees go out, they will fly around. They will do these circular motions. And the more displays that they can produce, they will attract the younger bees from the other hives who are going for their orientation flight. So they go out and they say, wow, there's a lot of activity next to that hive. That's a lot more exciting than my hive. Let's go into that place. Okay, so if you have an Italian hive that's very good at sessions or having a midday orientation flight. Normally, that's also when the queen mates. So the queen mates, or she goes out on a mating flight during that time, because there's less risk of her being taken by a bird because there are lots of other bees flying at the same time. So certain hives have got a tendency to have an exaggerated session. So they get lots of bees, the bees will fly around in the open for a long duration. And that'll attract the other ones into that area. Okay, so a lot of things to consider. Also, one of the things that we've got to look at is if a hive does attract a lot of young bees, it actually stimulates the queen to lay more eggs. And the queen will look better than others that are losing it. So again, it's very difficult to gauge what hive is actually better than the other hive. Especially if you're losing all the forager bees, if you're losing all the young bees, there's not enough stimulation to keep those hives going. So they look as though they're doing not so well. While the other ones that are gaining a lot encourage the queen to lay more, and it does produce a lot more. What is the ideal? What should we be doing as beekeepers? I'm sorry if I'm walking around all the time, but I'm there. Okay, so what should we be doing as beekeepers? What do hives do? Number one, the bees do not confuse very easily two hives. If you have two hives together, they generally get the left and the right correct. Once you put three down, then you've got problems. Then you'll find they'll start drifting a lot more. So keep your hives to two hives together. If it's possible, make the two hives and put a big space between two hives and the next two hives.
How big of a space?
Okay, I would, the further, the better. Okay, so what I would do over here is I would put 30 feet, 60 feet between those two hives. Do I do that? And the answer is no. Why? It's too much effort. Okay, when you're manipulating your hives, I keep mine generally in a row. I can't afford to put them 30 feet that way. I anticipate that we do have drifting. I know how the drifting occurs. You choose the queen rearing and the queens that are genetically better through other tactics. You're analyzing your brood every single week on all of your hives. You know how they're doing. You know exactly how they develop. You know exactly what's happening to them. And you know the drifting, you can see it. And you can know that you can then bring brood or cap brood onto another hive that might need it. Okay. And again, looking at the Chinese influence, the fact that maybe we should have apiary sites that are circular in nature. It aids a lot more with our manipulation of the hive. You'll have a 30-foot gap between one side and the other side, and they normally keep, I think it's about 20 to 30 hives. Not that I advocate using 20 to 30 hives, but in a circular pattern.
And you're stating that in a circular pattern, with all the entrances going in, if you're not in the zone where it's flying in and out.
That's correct. You're not in the flat part of the bees.
I understand. You're not in their zone if you're not in the way of their food source and the group, circular group. I would think that somewhere along the circle, you're going to be in.
You could be, but they've got fairly large circles.
I mean, I never see them fly like this and they come down to the high. It's kind of the P line.
That's it, yes.
So I would think that like if you have a source of food somewhere,
Yeah.
somewhere on that circle, there's going to be you're going to get patted in the head by a bunch of bees that are going in and out. Yes.
Yeah, you could, I mean, I've never tried the circular mechanism, so, but they just say it's what they do.
Better work.
Yeah, so it seems as though it's, you know, and the reason for them doing it is, number one, easy to manipulate the hives, and secondly, they, the orientation flights, they tend to know the orientation of the front of the hive. But very often you're limited with the apiary site. Okay, any questions?
Where would you, if you had a complete circle,
Yeah.
would you face, you were to have them face, all the hives face south? Like
No, all the hives are facing to the center.
to the center, okay.
All the hives face directly into the center. And they normally, apparently, I haven't done this, but apparently they will find their way, there'll be less drifting. Because they all know the orientation that they left the hive from. So they'll orientate on their hives. Okay, So again, apiary site selection, queen selections, and so on. So when we're looking at queens, always look at the number of variables that occur with things like drifting. Okay, the next point, going a little bit more complex over here. I look at another apiary site of mine, and I have the center hives always do better. So I've got a periphery going one way, I have got a slight angle, and always I try to keep 10 hives. How many hives should we have at an apiary site? How many hives should we prudently have at an apiary site? What is the maximum? What is the minimum? Very good. Somebody said 6. I would totally agree with 6 hives at an apiary site. How many do I keep? 10. Okay. But as you start going above, okay, so let's look at our area, what we know. Honey flow. I harvest honey in April. Okay. We get a nice April flow, but our main honey harvest is in May. Okay, where some of our hives gain 20 pounds in a single day because of the black locust, and we now have a recent flow in which we're getting the honeysuckle quite predominantly. Okay, so we've got the main honey flow, then gradually gets less and less in June, July, August, September. Gradually peters out and we get less and less honey. So the major flows that we have, early season, always depends on the weather. How? Oh, yeah. One of the apiary sites we're looking at, and as I said, a slight angle, so a slight curve, and I find the central hives always do better. Okay, the central ones, guaranteed, they will do better. The end ones don't do that nicely. And what is the reason? And the reason we as beekeepers, we think in 2 dimensions. Okay, we say, okay, the bees go out, they're all facing the same way. The bees go out and they come back, and they might be going to the central hives, or might go to the periphery hives, the ones on the 2 outer edges. But we're not looking in 3 dimensions. Okay, in other words, in this particular apiary site, the bees are coming back from behind the hives. Okay, they're not coming back from straight as you would anticipate they're doing. The honey flows behind them. They're taking off and they're heading off back. Then if you look in 3 dimensions, if you go into Google Maps and you could maybe take an aerial or take drone footage of it, and you can imagine yourself as a bee coming back, it's often the hive that is first visible as the one that they would enter. Yeah. One of my other apiary sites has one hive that's almost hidden away, almost in a bush, so you can't really see it. But as you turn a certain corner, it's the only one you can see. That one gains bees because it's a prominent. They focus on the one and they will head into it. When they come back, always remember they might be coming back from behind you. So imagine them coming back and they will see one you don't anticipate them to go, and they will go back round and they will enter the wrong hive. Okay. Just like to ask, has anyone ever thought about this? Has anyone ever thought about sessions and where the bees return to and how they return, and whether they prefer a certain color or not a color? And if you create a facade for them, you can make, in other words, this is genius. Because what you do is you get your next apiary site with a colleague. Okay, so they have 4 hives, you have 4 hives. And what you're going to do is you're going to paint your ones light blue. Okay, you're going to put a facade in front to make it look bigger. Okay, so you will inherit all of their bees when they come back. Your hives will gain so many more bees. They are going to be so much more powerful. They will make so much more honey than the others. Then you find out where the nectar flow is. But the nectar and all the nice trees and all the nice plants are on the left-hand side. You make sure that your bees are on the left-hand side when they're returning. And make sure, if they're moving behind you, that their hives are disguised by nice wind-protecting bushes. There we are. Why do your bees always produce more honey? Okay, any questions?
should you have same colors of your hives, or does the different
No,
colors make a difference?
The common theory behind that, and if I had more time, I would do this, every hive should be different. Okay, what I do is I have a stencil, and I will spray paint on the stencil, like a flower, a sunflower, or a little picture. At that time, I'll paint something on so they're all distinctive. And I do this especially for nucleus hives. Nucleus hives are especially susceptible to drifting. If you take a nucleus hive, here's a classic example. You have two big hives, you're coming back from collecting a swarm. You take that swarm, you put it between your two big hives. There's space in the hive stand. Okay, that nucleus hive will get depleted of bees. They will drift onto the bigger ones. Those of you who've done it, you know it. It happens. Your middle hive that you place in there will drift to the two on either side. Those two will get bigger. The central one won't do that nicely. Okay. What else? Anything? Okay, let's we can quickly do. George gave his spiel on what he does for winter, and I can describe what's happened to me. Okay, I have 103 hives. Okay, large production hives and so on, and I have lost 0. Last year, I lost 1 nucleus hive. Why did I lose a nucleus hive? I lost it due to drifting. So I've got a nucleus yard, 20 nucleus hives in the nucleus yard. I don't want to keep big hives and nucleus hives together. The ones on the end are susceptible to drifting, and you end up with no bees in the one, and just a queen and a couple of bees trying to keep it warm, and the cluster size gets too small to survive the winter. Okay, so at the moment I have lost none. So last year I lost 1. This year, at the current time, I've lost none. Now I'm really, really surprised. Okay, I am amazed. Because I put catcher boxes up, and the last year what I did is I put catcher boxes in the trees. If I'm driving to an apiary site and somebody's got a tree house for kids that have grown up, I ask them if I can put it up there. I put it in trees. I've got them all over the place. So you're catching swarms. So swarms are going to people's houses. You're catching them. So the normal ones I caught, and I put them together, put them nicely, and they all good. But I had 3 that I neglected. In other words, bees moved into them. And whenever I got to the apiary site, I said, oh no, I've got a swarm, I've caught a swarm, it's all wonderful, yeah, I'll come back next time with a ladder. When I came back, I forgot the ladder again, and it just repetitively went on. So I had 3 hives that were not treated. They weren't my bees, they were not treated. And one, I eventually had to do a cutout. So I didn't treat those 3 hives. They were untreated. All my hives, normally I start the treatment around about the 15th of July. But the amazing thing, those 3 hives, they're all alive. Now, what is the difference between all the treatment and the non-treatment, the ones that haven't been treated, is the fact that the cluster size is a lot smaller. So those ones on average are a lot smaller. They look more susceptible. They all had the oxalic acid dribble, so those 3 should be varroa free. But I would not have expected them to survive as well as they did. Okay, so I would almost expect them to die. Okay, just purely because I didn't do early treatments on them. They weren't part of the regime. In fact, it's difficult to climb up a tree without a ladder and treat them, you know. So it is my neglect of those ones, but amazingly enough, those 3 are still alive.
So, question from the internet.
There's somebody listening on the internet.
If you have 6 hives in a row, various colors of timbers, and supers get mixed up, does that cause disorientation? Supers create their cloud.
I don't think so. I haven't seen a confused bee. So if you mix the supers up, I haven't noticed the bees are confused, but it's when you do adjust them, you can see if you reduce an entrance, so you have a recessed entrance, you recess it back, you know, as the bees do get confused, they come back to the old entrance instead of maybe the new entrance that you've got. But I haven't seen them. I mean, if you've got your main entrance available, then they normally go for that main entrance. Any other questions? Okay, and in opposition to George, George says he does a deep, he's overwintering in a deep. We overwinter in smaller hives, we overwinter in nukes. In other words, a nucleus and a nucleus above, and you generally don't lose them either. They, as long as you've treated, as long as you've fed, as long as the bees are healthy, they survive. Okay, and the difference is I overwinter almost all my main hives with 3 boxes. So in other words, there are 30 frames in my hives. I've not lost a big hive for about 3 years now. They survive. Okay. And it's often not whether you've got 1 brood chamber or 2 brood chambers, or you've got, my configuration is bottom board. I have a super underneath that. I then have a 10 frame deep and another 10 frame deep. And the reason for doing that is that I don't have space for 100 supers inside my garage. I don't have a space in my garage for an extra 100 deeps. Imagine that, storing all of that. So mine is stored out in the field, and they're all alive. They're all very happy. And one of the major advantage why I don't go for a single deep is that this is my lazy time. I want to go on a vacation. I don't care about my bees now. I have them, they are overfed, they're fat. I fed them beautifully in the fall last year. They've got ample space, they've got ample stores. And I check them periodically, I lift them, but I can go on vacation. If you're dealing with a single brood chamber, you've got, it's the same with nucleus hives. They're a lot more difficult to manage. You've got to make sure that they don't run out of food. So it's just laziness on my part, but it works. And again, for the last 15 years, I use top entrances, works wonderfully. Okay. So bottom entrance, top entrance, and just as another fact that I don't think it's all this configuration, and you know, we're arguing about stuff that's maybe not important. On one of my apiary sites, one of my nucleus hives, one winter, I went back to my apiary site, and the previous time I was there, I'd obviously pushed the hive bodies, and the top was open, maybe about 3 inches. So the previous time I'd left it open. I parked my truck there and I said, that nucleus hive is dead. Okay, there's no way that that could survive. There's a gap this much, as obviously last time I knocked it, or maybe a deer knocked it, or whatever it was. And it's a big gap, rain would have come in, and I hadn't seen them for a month. Okay, so they had obviously taken strain. They were completely alive, but they, from then on, they hated me with a passion. Okay, so I couldn't go near that hive, but they survived. We go into all these raptures about you have to do this, you have to do that. And sometimes you make mistakes and you realize, okay, they built to survive. Number 1, keep your bees healthy. Number 2, don't worry too much about all the other stuff. Make sure that there's enough food for them. So food in their proximity, and keep that Varroa count down. Okay. Anything else? Any questions from the internet? Any questions? Yes. Anyone who'd like to ask a question, they can type it in. Howard's got a question.
Do you provide water for the bees in the winter?
Do I provide water for the bees in winter? And the answer is yes. Okay. And often it's just pre-planning the fact that they're near a water source. Like I've got my bees are at Highland Orchards, and they're next to the ponds that were set up there. So they do need to dilute the honey. It's a very good idea to have water source nearby. So, and remember, that's throughout the season, not only winter, but the whole way through. One of the most important things is supplying water. Also, when you do supply water, remember that it's best to supply it about 20, 30 feet away from the apiary site. And the reason for that is the navigation. The bees can't navigate when it's in a close proximity. They will find it, but it's best. So if one bee gets water and it says, okay, I've got some nice water, and then he's 30 feet away, can tell that direction. Otherwise, it gives it the proximity and somewhere in the area. So always have a little distance away that they can go and get the water from there. So nice, warmed, pale. And the other thing, one of our major problems that we have is the fact of what do we do with this cold weather? The bees are brooding up. They're creating a lot of brood. They're creating drone brood. Do we have to worry about reversing brood chambers? And the answer is no. This cold weather puts a freeze on it. If they were starting swarm preparations, that's going to stop. Okay, they're not going to swarm. They're going to reverse it. You find that some years we have it. They will start swarm preparation, and if there's 5, 6, 10 days of very cold weather, this is cold now, the wind chill factor, they reverse it. Unfortunately, the drones will hatch and so on. So the main thing we do now, make sure there's food. Make sure that you have everything on there. If you are feeding, remember there is a hit to everything you do. Every little thing that you do. If you're feeding pollen patties, there might be positive, there might be negative. If you're feeding pollen patties, you might also be feeding the bees. So remember, take it off, freeze it. I like doing external pollen feed, pollen powder external, because it doesn't influence the bees. Okay, you external, if they need it, they get it. And they need the protein, they will find it. All I do is take a pail, drill some holes, put a container in the pail, close it up so it doesn't get wet, leave it. If the bees want it, they use it. But those are also excellent things, absolutely amazing things for birds' nests. So you can collect a couple of birds' nests in there as well. Okay, I think, Bernadette?
Yeah, sorry, when you talk about your rating level overwintering and the bottom is, super.
Yeah.
Now, that super, is that full of supplies?
Okay,
And if so, or is it empty, and if it is full of supplies, how do you check it without going through?
okay, Bernadette's got a really good question. She says, what do I do with the super that's on the bottom? And so I've got 2 deeps and then a super on it. What happens if there's feed in that super? How do you check whether there is feed in there? Generally, what happens when you come in, the bees reorganize the honey in the fall. So you've done this in the fall, you've done the reverse, you've got the super on the bottom. They will generally clean it. I mean, I say generally because some bees don't listen to my commands. They will ignore me. But generally, that'll be empty, completely empty, which is beautiful for the next season because you've got it, it's all well prepared. You will then put that on top of the queen excluder and then fill that with honey. So generally I don't care at this stage. I'm not going to dismantle my hives at this stage. So what I'll do is when it comes time for the honey harvesting or honey preparation, which will be 14th of April this year. Okay, so prepare roughly 14th of April, my super will go on to the top above a queen excluder. And remember, it all depends on your hive size. You might have smaller hives. So just to give you a rough idea, our main flow is probably a month later than that. And swarm preparations, I would guess, because of this cold patch, I would guess at about 21st of April. That's a wild guess, by the way. That's an absolutely wild guess. That's when the first swarm will appear. So you reverse your brood chains. Now that might change in a week's time. I might have another estimate there. Anything else? Yeah, good question.
Question was, have you reversed in boxes yet?
No, definitely not. We're on the cold patch. We will not be reversing. The queen is slowing down the laying, so she's not laying as much now. But you would not be reversing at the moment. It's detrimental. You might be breaking a cluster into 2, and it's detrimental for it. The next question is, those of you who've wrapped the hives, please do not take the wrapping off. This is the critical time. On your bee, your hives, your wrapping, this is the most critical time. And I've heard people saying, oh, I'm removing my wrapping, it's springtime, it's just about to turn into summer. you keep the wrap on for as long as possible. Okay, you keep it on, and the reason for that is it's cold. They've got to maintain the temperature of 92 degrees Fahrenheit. They've got to maintain that temperature. That's a lot easier if you've got a wrap on and you get the solar gain and so on and so forth. So always keep the wraps on. And it's often the wind chill factor. If you break your hives apart, you don't have a wrap on, the wind can actually go through the hives. So please don't, I mean, the bees could survive if you reverse it, but there's no, the queen's really slow her laying down. Your most important thing at the moment is to make sure that there's feed in the hive. So always make sure there's feed. And can you open the hive when there's 40 degrees? You can. Remember, the main problem with opening a hive is wind chill factor. If it's still and nice, you can open at 40 degrees, but you keep it to an absolute minimum, and it has to be an emergency to open it up. And you would then put a frame of honey that you've kept in store, and you keep it, put it next to the cluster. Okay.
Next to where? Cluster.
Next to the cluster, right next to the cluster. And remember, yeah, it's the cluster size is very, very important for winter survival. If you have a big cluster size, they are a lot more adaptable. They can get to honey locations that are further away, and they can morph their shape to get to the honey. Once you get a small cluster about the size of 2 grapefruits, it's very difficult for them to access the honey by changing the shape. They can't get to a lot of the honey. You'll find a lot of them will start to death with lots of honey because the cluster size is too small. Okay, that's all. Thanks, guys. Okay.
Thanks, Steve.
How to confuse everyone?
No, not at all.
And now.
So for the folks that are online, this is the end of the meeting. So thank you very much.